your talk.
Yes, I had Dr. Jones's romantic poetry class last semester. I took it honors by contract, and our agreement was that I would write a lengthened research paper for my assignment. And the regular length research paper was already 8 to 10 pages, so I assumed it would only be about 10 to 12 pages. He assigned me a 12 to 15 page paper. So I thought, if I'm going to put that much work into it, I might as well, get a little extra mileage out of it. So I wrote a paper about the perception of feminism in Anna Barbault's Rights of Woman. We had this poem assigned in our syllabus, and on reading it, it just confused me. And I'm an English major. I don't usually get very confused by poems, although I might not see everything at first glance, but this poem just confused me. The last two lines seem to contradict the rest of the poem, and it's a fairly long poem. I wasn't sure, it's very strongly worded, so I wasn't sure why these last two lines would seemingly contradict the rest of the tone of the poem. So I tried to look at the context of Anna Barbauld and why she would be writing this way. And what I found was that in the context of the political discourse of her era, with the gender perceptions and the gender roles that she had to inhabit, in the relationships with her contemporary writers, with her contemporary female writers, the poem kind of just falls into place really beautifully. So Rights of Woman is written in 1793. It is, educational and professional opportunities for women are improving hand over foot, but it's serious political power, serious social power is still very far from reach. One of my main sources for this paper, an article by Elizabeth Rassinen, she says that the last two lines of the poem in Barbault's turn to love at the end of the poem, in which she claims that mutual love between two people will correct any perceived bias or any perceived inequality in a relationship. She says that this turn to love is not the most desirable path to equality, it's a compromise. So Barbauld was a well-educated woman. Her father was a teacher, and as was her husband. She had more opportunities than most women of her day, and through her education she was able to see that the opportunities women had were almost non-existent, that the best way to equality in her opinion was an education, a well-rounded education, which women weren't allowed to have. She is forced to reconcile her desire for an equal educational opportunity and equal intellectual discourse between sexes with the slow pace at which her culture was changing. She was so far ahead of where her culture was headed that she almost couldn't bear it. She had to compromise to continue to succeed. She sees mutual love as the only avenue by which she can find respect and find this deep intellectual discourse that she craved. In this poem, equality isn't reached through equal opportunity, but through the absorption of one spouse's identity with the other. She says equal right, or she says that the identities are lost in mutual love. So it's not about each person being their own person, being the best that they can be. It's about melding into one being and taking on each other's, the bad things and the good things with each other. Furthermore, this compromise can only be implemented on a case-by-case basis. It can't be implemented on a cultural level, which is very important to Barbauld, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's by no means preferable or permanent. It is very much, very much compromised, very much confined, and it's almost a phenomenon to be able to accomplish this respect within a relationship. She believed that women and men contained equal mental capabilities and logical reasoning, which seems obvious, but at that day was an extremely, extremely just wild to most people. She saw that women were stunted more by the lack of education than by something inherent in them. It's not about what women or what men can do, it's about the opportunities that people have. So her life's goal is to provide education. She was an educator, as well as being a very prolific writer. She wanted to advance women's ability to find their education and to improve their logical faculties through an education. So when she saw that a lot of women were using the gendered stereotypes, were overperforming femininity to try to gain some amount of power, it made her angry, and she expresses that in her poem. She uses this traditional image of a woman as this pure angel dressed in white, coming to purify everything, and she satirizes it. She says, "Bid proud man his boasted rule resign." But if you notice, she says bid, and she asks the man to resign his role. She's not actually wresting any power, she's asking for it. She's just asking for it to be given. She's not gaining any on her own. By this, Barbauld is trying to communicate that gaining power through performing a gender role is never going to break out of those gender roles, is never going to result in any equality, because those gender roles are still subjugated. She refers to this female ideal as a courted idol, as someone to be worshipped, and then cuts that by saying, you know, this worship will end. You shouldn't count on it, because the power you gain through it can't be counted on. It can't be, you need to be wary of it, because it will fall through. It won't last forever. So at the end of this poem, she has broken down all of these aspects of power that women might be able to find, and she says it would be better to just to find this equality through mutual love, through this relationship, than trying to reinforce these gender roles that are the reason we're having issues. And she, when I went back and read through some of her other poetry, it became very apparent that social inequality was vital to her. She, in her poem, The Caterpillar, which discusses a narrator who mercifully doesn't kill this caterpillar, only to find out that this narrator just came from killing a whole nest of these caterpillars. She discusses that this kind of form of what she calls sympathy spontaneous is not useful, is not something to be respected. We should be attempting to communicate compassion on a cultural level, not in these little defined moments of time, but as a whole. Similar to the caterpillar and the mouse's petition, Barbauld uses she writes to her friend Joseph Priestley, who is a scientist, and writes a poem about a mouse, who is the speaker of the poem, who asks Priestley to set it free, because Priestley was going to use the mouse in experiments in which the mouse would probably die. It argues that the benefits of capturing it don't outweigh the moral cost of destroying the life of an innocent creature. And Barbauld's use of the mouse's voice communicates her desire to communicate in the sciences. She was extremely interested in science. She knew a lot about it, but her opinions were never taken seriously because women weren't allowed in research science at this time. They weren't allowed to perform experiments. So she uses this mouse's voice to tell her friend to cut it out, to tell her friend, this is not the best way that you could be doing this. But she doesn't allow the gender perception of science, the gender roles in science, to keep her from expressing her opinion. She finds a way to express it. And she warns her friend Priestley that if he continues to treat other creatures in such a harsh way, he's going to find that some creature higher than him is going to do the same to him one day. She warns him. She has this nuanced depiction of power imbalances in relationships. She doesn't shy away from these power imbalances. She says, we have a responsibility, any privileged person has a responsibility to take on the problems of people with less social power and make them their own and try to fix them. Her depiction of relationships really comes through in her poem Washing Day, in which it talks about washing day at a house, at a large house with many kids and female servants, and the wife, the head of the house, takes on this almost battle against all of the washing that needs to be done. And she invokes this amuse at the very beginning of her poem, which sets up this very formal tone. And she just transforms the domestic subject, the seemingly unimportant subject, into this meaningful, powerful event in which women come together, throw aside their gender roles, do not feel the need to be kind or to be nurturing to the other people in the house. They have a job to do. And the formal language she uses raises these domestic activities to a higher plane of language on par with epic poetry. She places the utmost importance on experiences of women in their day-to-day lives. Her women don't trifle with common pleasantries. They come together and tackle a daunting little work. They retire the trivial social requirements of their gender roles, and it follows that if these women can come together like this, why can't the men? Why can't the men see that we don't need these roles, we don't need these perceptions? This whole poem kind of implies her desire for a domestic setting in which both labor and respect would be equally shared. She admired the lives of women, and her desire for a society that respected women as she did is evident through this poetry. On the flip side, her love for the lives of women was often existed in the background of her religious and political beliefs. She didn't think that the gender discrimination was ideal, but she also wanted to be respected as a political idealist, as a political proponent. And that identity was more important to her than trying to tackle gender directly. She saw other people tackling gender, and she thought, well, I need to tackle things like abolition, things like freeing people. So she focused a lot of her writing on non-gender discussions about other oppressions, so she could be considered equal, so that she could be considered along with her male counterparts, which she did very successfully. She performed this actively intellectual lifestyle that through her actions subverted these gender roles. She might not have said it, but she did it. She performed it. She dissembled these views of authority and did not become intimidated by them. She relied on her own perceptions, her own intelligence and education, and she performed this life in which she would not be held back by her gender. She pulled inspiration from the dissenting doctrine, which allowed her to dissemble these views of authority, and pulled from Stoicism, which allowed her to rely on herself and envision a path for feminism that could be accepted by society in her era. She strove toward a view of women which would allow men and women to communicate intellectually on the same level, without gender distracting from ideas and opinions and the more important subjects. She thought that these gender roles were trivial and not important. They didn't mean anything to her. So she wanted to focus on bigger problems at hand. She didn't want her gender to be holding her back from these intellectual discussions. Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a writer around the same era of Barbauld, is often seen as a foil to her, even wrote in Vindication of the Rights of Woman, "Speaking of women at large, their first duty is to themselves as rational creatures." And Barbauld enacted that. She acted that way within her life. The ideal society described both by Barbauld and by Wollstonecraft is one in which men and women, both being viewed as rational beings, would not be forced to work under the intellectual restriction of bias. She believed the only lasting change in women's favor would result from exemplifying the positive rational capabilities of women. And any attempt in her mind to gain power through the exploitation of those gender stereotypes would be an insult to that ideal that she tried to enact. Her relationship to feminism, as it's understood today, is a complex and calculated response to the social, intellectual, and political pressures of her time. While her writings were not overtly feminist, her lifestyle and insistence in voicing her opinions are. Anna Barbauld's feminism is based on action and subtle subversion rather than in decrying the plight of women in a patriarchal culture. And the subtlety of Barbauld's feminist beliefs is not always easily understood by modern readers. Barbauld's true feminist beliefs are often muddled and misrepresented because of the works included in anthologies. In past anthologies, and the anthologies now are better, but in past anthologies, a lot of her political works were excluded. Were not included in her sections of work because they didn't adhere to the standards of a proper woman. They weren't. She was not nurturing. She was not enduring and kind. She brought up these issues. She would not face away from them, and that got her into trouble when it came to anthologies because people didn't want to hear it from a woman. Like I said, now her works are starting to be included more and more. All of the works that I refer to in this paper were found in one anthology. So her works are now being respected more, and it's easier to see how her goals for feminism have been implemented. Barbauld's goals for feminism show through the context of her life and her other writings. They're vital to interpreting this poem. It can initially seem contradictory, but the satire discouraging over-performing femininity makes the whole poem fall into place. We can see that this desire for rational and intellectual discussion causes an almost despairing view in this poem. And upon initially reading it, it seems like a call to action for women, but in reality it's this biting satire of how intellectual debate has not been implemented and how it is absolutely necessary to implement this intellectual debate, or the only way we will be able to find equality is through these specific instances of relationships in which women are humanized. But her real desire is for a complete and total culture-wide view of equality.